Wow. This episode of the Wealth Alchemist podcast with Mark Gober is deep, it's big, and it's likely to get you thinking outside your box. We cover a lot in this truly profound conversation. Have you ever considered, really considered, the role that government plays in the way that we show up in our freedoms in life? Have you considered if you are actually truly free to be a sovereign being in the ways that we are being governed right now? Mark shares his research that is mind-opening in the way that we think about our government. And I also love that he is very scientific in his approach to spiritual principles. And we talk about how the spiritual principles and the government and the role that they play within each other. Once we get through that, we actually also both dream of a very different future for this world. And I really invite you to listen into the way that we see what can be possible on this planet. It's a very practical and yet deeply visionary conversation that I'm super duper excited to share with you. So please enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Wealth Alchemist podcast. My name is Carrie Norley. I am the host of the show today and every other day. And today I don't even know the words. So excited for this conversation. I feel like the two of us are going to be able to jam for hours on this, but we are going to try and contain ourselves to the time of the podcast. I have Mark Gober on the call with me. He is a real smarty pants. Let me just tell you, he's an international speaker and the author of the author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was awarded the IPI Best Science Book of 2019. He is also the author of An End to Upside Down Living in 2020, and is the host of the podcast, Where Is My Mind, starting in 2019. Previously, Gober was a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley and worked as an investment banking analyst. Sounds real smart. In New York. He has been named one of IAM's Strategy 300, the world's leading intellectual property strategist, and he graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University. Like I said, we have a smarty pants, and I say that we have a smarty pants on our conversation today because I think it's relevant. I think it's really relevant because we're going to have a really deep dive conversation into freedom, I don't usually bring politics to the state of this conversation, but we're going to have a really amazing conversation around the government and metaphysics and how this all comes together, which is really some of my favorite things to talk about, and how we ultimately are going to be visioning. The two of us have a big vision, I think, for a future that does not look the same as what we are looking at right now. And in order to have that, there has to be an understanding, an awakening of what actually exists in this world right now from a very, very logical perspective, which is one of the reasons I'm super excited for this conversation. And and the fact that he brings in the metaphysics to this, it's like mind-boggling. So with that introduction, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm looking forward to this.
It'd be amazing. Okay, so how about we start with, Mark just wrote a new book. So he's just talked about all these other books, but he's written a new book. It's called An End to Upside Down Liberty. Can you give us an overview of what this book is and why you've worked? It's a really important piece of work for right now in this world.
Well, it deals with politics and the basic nature of government. We live in a world where there are governments that rule over us, and they have laws, and the governments provide services for citizens. These are very basic facts that I never really thought about until I started researching it. And the book is really questioning the structure of government, basic features of it. And I propose a different way of governing across the world that would be much more aligned with metaphysical principles, the ones that I talk about so much in my first two books and my podcast. So basically what I'm addressing is, what is the ideal way of organizing society, politically and economically? And how can we align that with the nature of reality?
So amazing. So to start this conversation, and I really highly recommend you get this book. It is, as we got onto the call, I said to Mark, it is one of the best written books I have seen with factual evidence to really help understand what's actually happening in the world right now, including the Constitution, people, right? And it's crazy. I was even just listening recently to a conversation or a presentation by Robert Kennedy, who you talk about in the book. And he was literally breaking down how each one of them, almost every single one of our liberties within the Constitution, within the Declaration of Independence, is not being followed right now. Like they're all being broken, except for number 2, Amendment 2, which is the right to bear arms, which they would like to, I'm sure, at some level take, but the NRA is way too strong for that, I think. Right?
Yeah. Yes. That's the trend for sure.
So can you drop into a little bit about that? I love how you talked about the state and how ultimately, like we talk about freedom and what is freedom, but then ultimately you start to bring into this conversation is, are we really free? Right?
Yeah.
Do we actually have our liberties right now? Or are they slowly? And you said this comparison. I made a comparison earlier this year on Facebook, actually comparing what's going on now with what happened in the Holocaust. It's not like we all of a sudden, and I'm Jewish, it's not like as a Jewish, group of people, we all of a sudden, like there was one day that we woke up and we were all put out into concentration camps. I don't say we, but like as a collective and all the other people that were involved in this. It gradually happened over time because liberty started to be taken. And you start talking about that in its own way here. So please do explain how that works.
Yeah, and I should add that prior to really pandemic era, these were not topics I thought about. I was not political at all. I didn't care about politics. I was doing other stuff with business, and these were not topics I thought about. But all of a sudden, with the pandemic, we saw censorship. If you had ideas that countered the narrative that we're being told, you're booted off of Facebook and YouTube, for example. And the government was deciding things like, well, this business is essential, but this one's not. You're going to stay in your home for this period of time. So our liberties were very clearly being eroded. And they would say, well, we're doing this to protect you. This is for your safety. And one of the core paradigm flips that I explore in this book, and it's been a big one for me, is to view government not as the protector, but rather as the predator. And if we flip everything and we start to look at the way in which our liberties are being taken away, like you said, there are parallels to the Holocaust for sure, and many other examples throughout history where governments have become oppressive. So it's a new way of looking at the news, for example. Any piece of news that comes out, it's typically framed to us as, well, we're doing this new measure because we're trying to help you. And if you think about it, maybe actually that's not the case if we look at what's actually happening to us. So from a spiritual perspective, there's this notion often of the wolf in sheep's clothing, to beware. And that's just a theme that comes up for me all the time, because we see people presenting as sheep, but if you think about what they're actually doing, they're not telling you they're doing it, but what's actually happening to our lives is very much like what a wolf would do.
I'd love to have you drop a little further into that, because I think it's a really beautiful point, and I'd like for people to get a little bit deeper into what that actually looks like.
Yeah, well, I think lockdowns are a good example where, look, we're trying to protect you, so we're going to lock you down, and well, it might affect your income, it might affect your business, but we're not going to talk about that. This is to protect you. Well, what's actually happening? You're becoming enslaved in a sense. And it's sometimes hard to see that because, yes, there is an illness going around and there have been horrible things happening with that. And that sometimes clouds our judgment, where it's almost like if there's an emergency, that gives an excuse for liberties to be taken away. And that's how I think the wolves in sheep's clothing present. They say, well, this is an emergency. We're just doing it for your safety. But the net effect is not going to be a good thing. And if we look at governments throughout history, there have been many examples where it leads to enslavement. We can look at North Korea, we can look at what's happening in communist China, Soviet Russia. I think in the West, we are not as attuned to the warning signs, because we say, oh, well, we have a constitution, America is the freest place in the world, and historically it has been a very free place, so we're not as apt to be critical, I find. Like it would never happen here.
Right. And like I said, but it's slowly over time, one little piece. And it's so interesting because, I mean, for me, I have definitely, it's one of my favorite reasons for the podcast. I'm sure you agree. Between a podcast and a book, we can finally have our voice heard without being censored. I have 100% been censored on Facebook. It has sucked for talking about crypto, for talking about, just freedom, literally make your own mind up and have a choice. And things get censored all the time on there for me. And I also see, and my husband is a massage therapist. And I was like, how is it that all of a sudden, our bodies became unessential, right?
Right.
Who makes that choice when actually those of us who are home and stranded and not moving and can't, it's actually absolutely essential, or people who are in pain and they were seeing people for every week. All of a sudden, like, how is that not essential? And so I think it's a really important thing that you bring to this, in that it's like, who made up this? Who decided this? And why did they make these decisions? And these decisions that have been made all along the way. And I find it interesting, like, even in our right to choose, right? Like, who gets to make the decision? Because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that I get to tell you what to do with your body. Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I agree with you. And this is the same excuse is used. Well, it's for your safety. And there's another important excuse, which is that it's for the good of society. It's for the common good. And therefore, you as an individual don't matter. And what the political researchers say, and I'm thinking of G. Edward Griffin, the author, and F.A. Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner, what they say is the greatest crimes in history, whether they're communistic or in the fascist regimes, they end up with this purely collectivistic mindset where all that matters is society, and the individual, well, your body, that's not, we don't care about that as much because it's in the benefit of society. The problem is that mentality can be used by corrupt leaders to justify anything. So I agree with you, Carrie, that bodily autonomy is really important. Who gets to decide what we put in our body and what we get to do with our body? And even if they did have good intentions, there's risk in anything medical, and each person has a different situation. So why would we entrust someone fully to make those decisions for us? It's the opposite of liberty. And
absolutely.
It sounds obvious when we probably talk about it like this, but if you just watch the news, it's not presented in this way. So really, you have to be like a detective. That's what I found. And I've been in a fortunate situation where I had left my job right before the pandemic, wrote my second book, had been researching all of this. So I've been watching very closely. And I could see how if you're busy with work and you don't have time to think about it, and you see your credible person news anchor that you believe on TV, you're not going to question things as much.
Totally. And then one thing leads to another. But I think it's not, I mean, like, and this is, to me, I just want to be really clear. This is not a pro or anti anything. It's a pro choice. Right. And that's how I sit on many of the choices that we have, like whether we could bring abortion to this, whether I would ever have one or not is irrelevant. Do I believe that somebody else has the right to choose? Absolutely. And so why does it become different in any other aspect of, and so it's been a fascinating thing to watch in this, like how we have these freedoms taken. And it's, I have to say personally, like recently I've had a real, like it's been, I'm going to say tough on my heart, I guess is the best way to say it. Watching so many people lose their jobs because they choose to have freedom and choose to make the choices. And it's like, why all of a sudden these people, I mean, these nurses and doctors who we've been praising for 18 months, thank God they are the heroes, right? This is what we've been saying for months, for a year and a half. And now all of a sudden they can't work, but they were a hero 2 days ago, and I'm like, how does that actually become okay? How did the government get to make that okay?
Yeah. And what amazes me is that the hypocrisy within it often goes unnoticed because it's not, the media doesn't tell us that, oh, well, we were just saying this about them yesterday, but today it changed. It's just sort of like, well, this is the new paradigm. And if you go against that, then you're a conspiracy theorist or something.
Oh, yes.
Right. Which is kind of crazy to me. So yeah, there is this idea of authority figures who know what's best. And that's also one of the things I'm challenging. The idea of a blind trust in authority leads to very dangerous things. And we've seen this like in Nazi Germany and other kinds of regimes where people will just follow orders because it's easier to do that
than to stand up for ourselves.
Right.
And it's interesting, you made a point too in there, that if I remember this, that you were basically saying, like, if you were given the choice to stand up against the government, right? Like for something that we believe in or don't believe in, right? Like, for example, you made this example about Nazi Germany. So all of a sudden we have all these Germans who are like, this is not okay that this is happening, right? And they're forced to comply. And if they don't comply, it's against the rules, but it goes against what they believe in. So where does that put us? And I think that's a really interesting place to be in the world right now, right? I mean,
yeah. So what you're getting at is one of the core criticisms I have of government as we do it. Government has the ability to basically set morality with its laws. And we don't have a real choice over that. We can say we elect officials, but it's really, the government is going to be there no matter what, and the people cycle in and out, and those laws get made. And that tells you what's moral. And if you disobey the law, then that's immoral under the law. But what happens if the law tells you to do something that does not align with your personal morality? like in Nazi Germany, the things that Germans were forced to do to Jews and other minorities. It was the law to do that. And they might have said, well, no, that conflicts with my morality. So by being moral and following the law, you are, and that is highly problematic for a structure that's governing all of society. How could you have that situation in place where you could be forced to engage in immoral acts?
For the betterment of other people, because you've been told.
Right, because this authority structure tells you that that's how it's going to be. So ultimately, what I argue is that instead of having effectively rulers, which is what we have, the situation needs to be much more voluntary, where our interactions with any supposed experts or anyone is by our own volition. And when that happens, then the morality is in our choice to engage or not engage. Whereas right now, things are imposed upon us. Right. And the difference between a more voluntary system, in the book, the term I use is voluntaryism.
I liked this word. I was like, ooh, this is interesting, an interesting concept of voluntaryism.
Voluntaryism. This is a political philosophy, basically. And the contrasting one is known as statism. Statism is how we do government right now, the state, that we have this government that imposes upon us. But as I was digging into what is the state really, it provides services to all of us. Police, courts, it helps with so many functions in society, roads. But in other areas of society, we have service providers too. Netflix, your gym. I used to be a service provider to my clients, and we'd have contractual relationships, for example. And in those other cases, like Netflix and gym and contractual relationship with clients, there's a contract. You have an agreement that I'm going to perform these services for you. And if I don't do them well, then there can be a potential termination. And this is going to be the price. And this is how we can adjust price, etc. With the government, we have implied consent. We don't have an explicit contract that lays out all the things government's going to do for us. And what happens if they don't perform? There's essentially no financial accountability, because no matter what the government does, it's going to collect taxpayer money, or it can effectively print money with the Federal Reserve and central banks. So you end up with this very awkward situation, which is not so good for the citizens. You have a ruling body that is going to have money no matter what. If unlike a real business, if you start to perform poorly, people stop paying you and you go out of business. But the government, if you perform poorly, it's still going to get paid. That's not such a good thing. We don't have an explicit contract. When you break it down, all of a sudden there's a recognition, at least for me, that's like this aha moment. We're not actually free. And it might feel like we're free, but over time, this structure will become parasitic. And it has in many places across the world. And we're starting to see it very starkly in America and other places where
we never thought we would.
We never thought we would. And the things that we can do on a daily basis, there are limitations that we can see all the time.
Yes, it's so fascinating. So, okay, so I want to move into the concepts around what you spoke around metaphysics and the voluntaryism. I think it's very fascinating what you're talking about. To me, it's like when you talk about voluntaryism, it reminds me. So I wrote the book, The New Wealth, Magnetize Abundance, Hold Your Wealth and Leave a Legacy. And in it, like, I really do have a vision of the new wealth, like of what does it look like when we have a currency or a world or a financial system that's for the people, right? And that we voluntarily choose to step into this, right? I wouldn't have used the word voluntaryism, but I'm like, oh, I can dig it. I can take where you're going. Yeah. And so like we actually get to be sovereign. And one of the things, so last week, I took the stage for the first time in a crypto conference. I don't know if you saw this.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was called the Miami Crypto Experience. And when I was asked to be very last minute on a panel, which was a lot about the new wealth and the new earth and where we're headed in this paradigm. And I say this because one of the things that you had said earlier was we've lost our individuality by actually moving into this statism. It becomes about the common good of everybody versus the individuality. And what I had said on the stage was, ultimately, what I believe is the more that we actually step into our own individuality, the more that we actually honor our own self-expression, then we can stand fully and wholly as we are with our own beliefs, our own consciousness, our own experience of life. And then together, we come together in unity. And that's how we rise up. And I think it's a very different way of thinking to the traditional way of thinking in the world right now, right? And generally speaking, because the way we've been programmed and conditioned. And I love that this conversation is happening because it's not like I want to honor anybody who's listening right now. Even Mark said it, like neither of us were thinking about this 2 years ago, right? This was not like I would have been sitting on that, like, yep, let's just go like a little sheep and run probably the same way that most people would have 2 or 3 years ago, right? But like this has brought a lot to me of going and saying like, is this really working? And so I also really appreciate like the metaphysical aspects of this because there is like an energetic experience to this that nobody really talks about. So I'd love to hear what you have to say around the metaphysical and how this actually starts to play into like, first of all, I actually love what you talked about with consciousness. And so I'd love for you to start there. Like, what does that look like for you as a definition?
Sure. And I'm glad you're going there because it does tie into this really important idea of the balance of individualism and collectivism, because I think there's a balance.
Yeah.
What happens is we go too far with collectivism, the individual doesn't matter, and that's very problematic. But you also don't want to be just fully selfish where no one else matters. There's this balance, and to me, that's a spiritual one, which gets to consciousness. What is consciousness? It's our sense of experiencing life. That's how I always define it. It's difficult to define because we can't touch it. We all have consciousness right now. Consciousness is what is experiencing this life at this moment. And in general, and I used to believe this too, like the scientific community would say it, the consciousness is something that comes out of our brain because our brain's really complex and it produces our capacity to experience. And this is the core of my podcast, Where's My Mind, in my first book, and Into Upside Down Thinking. That's what I challenge. There's a lot of evidence, tons and tons, suggesting that no, the brain doesn't create consciousness. It's the other way around. The brain is almost like a filtering mechanism or a blindfold that blocks us from a broader consciousness, and we're like a vehicle for it. And that's the, I go into this in much more detail, but that's the core idea. And the analogy I always like to use comes from a philosopher named Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says it's like we are whirlpools within an infinite stream of water, where the water represents consciousness. But we have the sense of being an individual where we're kind of blocked from the broader reality. And sometimes things will happen like a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or meditation, for example, and people will have a spiritually transformative experience where their perception expands beyond their individual whirlpool. So that's the framework that I like to use. To quote Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, because a lot of the quantum physicists came to similar conclusions, which is very interesting as well. He said, in truth, there is only one mind. And that's how I think about it. It's one mind, one consciousness, where we're like these dissociated whirlpools. We're individuals and collective at the same time, and neither can be ignored. So that's the lens from which I'm looking at this, all this political stuff, and all the science to back this up. Things like the reality of psychic abilities, which has been studied at Princeton University. The US government's released declassified documents. The University of Virginia has been studying things like near-death experiences and children who have memories of a previous life, over 2,500 cases. These are just snippets of the degree of evidence that's out there. And all of it points to the idea that consciousness isn't coming from the brain, but the brain is like this antenna or blindfold that's filtering and processing it.
Yeah, I think of the brain as like the thoughts. I mean, the brain is very physical, right? It's just thoughts. And it like, and its job actually is to like send signals. It makes thoughts and sends signals. Like, I mean, it's a very practical thing that we have as a brain. And our consciousness is so much bigger. Like we are so like the consciousness of the experience of life is so much bigger than each one of us. And I love how you said that, like it is a collective. And I think this is the important thing to talk about is it's a collective consciousness, right? You and I are one. We are all a bunch of cells that are here together that at some point are going to replace and be different cells in some other place, right? Every 7 years, our cells regenerate. I'm not even the same person I literally physically was 7 years ago. And maybe my cells are in you right now, right? I mean, that's literally how it works, right? And so when we look beyond that, beyond the physical body, it's this pulse, that's the unity, that's the consciousness. And I look at it like, for me, I guess one of my biggest missions on this planet right now is to shift the wealth consciousness. And the way that I always talk about this is like, it starts with each single human being deciding, I'm going to start to question my thoughts. I'm going to start to question what people are telling me. Everybody, my mother, my father, the government, my sister, my best friend, everybody, and like our teachers. And I look at the education system right now, and I don't want to go to there right now, but like, right, we are being conditioned, but our consciousness is being conditioned. It's the thought process, everything together. And the more that they condition the consciousness, this is how I think fear works in this point here, right? The more that we breed fear, the more that we have control, the more that they have control, they can actually control the consciousness by keeping it small. And they want to, because if they were to allow the consciousness to be at the extent that it is, we would have true freedom. We would have this utopia, right? Because there are other, I firmly believe, I don't get it yet. I don't like fully, right? But there are definitely beings on other planets that've got what we want. There are definitely beings in the world. They come here and they're like, hey, wake up, people. What the hell are you doing? You have everything you need, right? Everything that we need is on this planet. We have every resource we could possibly need. And we just have to choose to like, be like, okay, how do we break free from the thought process that we are of scarcity, lack, and a downward, I talk about it like a degenerative downward spiral, that we're in this downward spiral versus how can we look at it and shift the whole consciousness, like flip it on its head is what you're ultimately saying, flip it on its head and turn it into a regenerative one where we have enough food, where we have enough money, where we have like the whole world could be looked after in a beautiful, abundant way if we shift the way that we think about it, which is ultimately just programming.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And the way I think about it, the term I use is a shift in consciousness. That's really what we're talking about, is tuning our antenna into a different station collectively. And the more of us that can do that, I think the more we can solve many of these problems all over the world. But you're also alluding to something that I think is important to address, which is the idea that there are people who are psychopathic or just power hungry and lack empathy. And for many of us, it's difficult to relate to that kind of thinking, where to them, power is what matters. Other people's lives or how other people feel, that is not what matters to them. And so good people often have a hard time relating to evil. And so that's one of the points I wanted to make clear in this book. And when I talk about these things is that we have to account for the reality of evil, an opposing force to I think what is a loving force that's part of consciousness itself. And it provides us with an opportunity to evolve and learn and grow. So there's value to it. But if we ignore it and ignore that possibility that someone on TV who just seems so nice and says the right things and sounds politically correct, actually the person's just saying what you want to hear sometimes. And there's an agenda, and they're not going to tell you what that is sometimes because people in authority will lie. So I don't want to sound overly cynical, but we have to be discerning and say, is this really a sheep or is it a wolf in sheep's clothing? And if we don't do that, we run the risk of what civilizations have gone through for many all over the world for a long time. And we're in the middle of it now. I don't think it's helpful to give people the benefit of the doubt all the time. I think it's ultimately very naive and one of my biggest concerns I see in the world.
Yeah, it's true. Like it's the power and the greed that have Easter Island has, no people on it, that had Lemuria, like that had all of these societies fall, right? That we all of a sudden don't exist because power, ultimately, right? And if we all came together, and it's really interesting, it's one of the things that I love. I don't know what your stance is on crypto and blockchain and all this kind of stuff. I'm curious, but it's one of the reasons I love this, because we have this place where we can finally have like a decentralized organizations where we can come together. And you talk about voluntaryism. And when I look at that from the blockchain, we have that as a DAO. Have you heard about this stuff yet? I'm curious.
Only bits and pieces of it. I'm definitely not an expert on crypto, but the principles behind it, I totally back that. It's decentralization is perfect, right? Yeah.
So in this, they have these, it's like, I'm going to say it's new. I don't know if it's new, quote unquote. I've got my little parentheses up here, guys, as I'm talking. They're called DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. And ultimately, basically what happens is, as you buy a token, or you buy into the ability to vote. And the more people, like the best part about it is like the more people that are involved, which is what you want. Like if you're looking to be involved in an organization like this, the more people that are involved, the better, because it's more decentralized, right? We don't want one person on the top of a DAO. Like we don't want one person on the top of our country, really. That's why even in America, we don't have just a president. We have the president. We've got all these checks and balances. When they're all together on one side, I don't know. But like, right. But that is the purpose of it, right? Is that it was never just to be one person's power. And so when we start to look at what can happen now as we bring to this blockchain experience, it's like with a tap of a button, I became just as important as Joe Schmo down the street and this other person. And we don't have to have the same beliefs. We don't have to even know each other to both be able to buy in and vote on what is an outcome that would be shifting of the consciousness, right? That becomes for the people versus I said to my governor, this is what I want, but then he could go do whatever the hell he wants to, right?
Exactly. Right. You become autonomous. Each individual almost becomes like a little government in a sense. And that's we're not there right now, but that's how I see it in the future, where we are much more self-governing and interacting in a voluntary manner.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so we've got consciousness, we've got the state. We understand that there's consciousness. Now, I'm curious to know is that do you look at because I would say metaphysical stuff is different to consciousness. Do you have different like definitions, I'll say, for that?
Well, I guess it depends on the lens that's used. At one level, I could equate them and say that that all reality is consciousness, and that's a metaphysical statement to make. So consciousness and metaphysics are tied. So for the purposes of this discussion, we can say they are. We could probably find instances where that could be disproven or shown to be something else. But let's just say we're looking at the nature of reality. That's what I mean by metaphysics. What is this reality that we live in? Is it all just matter and we emerged through a random evolutionary process and then all of a sudden consciousness came out after 13.8 billion years, and when you die, there's no consciousness, which is what I used to believe for sure? Or is it the other way around, that consciousness is first and everything that we perceive in this world as being physical is actually just a manifestation of consciousness? There's no physical. Cells are 99.99999%, atoms are 99.99999% empty space. And quantum physics shows that you have a wave and a particle duality, so you don't even really have solid stuff. Basically, reality isn't what it seems to be based on our senses. And this is metaphysical. So if we take that base and say, all reality is consciousness, like I'm talking about, well, then what does that mean for how we should structure society? And that's where the blend comes in. There's an important point I should raise, which we haven't talked about yet. This is a really central piece because it ties into voluntarism. In near-death experiences, these are cases where a person, let's say they're in cardiac arrest, so some kind of major trauma to the body typically, and their brain is either completely off or there's only a tiny bit of functioning. And it's at a point where if we look at conventional neuroscience, the brain shouldn't be able to produce a very complex memory or a cognition or anything. And yet when people come back from these experiences, sometimes there's millions of these cases, they will sometimes report very elaborate things, that they were immersed in unconditional love, they saw mystical beings from other dimensions, they were hovering over their body. Sometimes they see things in the room accurately, and they come back in their body after being resuscitated and they tell the doctor what happened, and the doctor can't believe it. So when those happen, that's called a real memory, not a hallucination. So these are the point that many researchers make, and the University of Virginia, for example, has been looking at this. Many people believe that near-death experiences are real. They're not hallucinations, at least some of them. And that's significant because what often happens in a near-death experience is people review their whole life. So they relive all their events, and it happens not only from their own perspective, but from the perspective of each person that they ever impacted. So this is like the one mind getting to switch lenses from one whirlpool to another. It's like when you knock the brain out, you're able to switch and see what it's like to be someone else within the collective. And you get to feel that the pain that's inflicted, and you get to feel also the joy and the love that you brought to people through their eyes. And for my podcast, Where Is My Mind? Episode 6 is all about the life review. I interviewed scientists on this too, but also I talked to people who've had life reviews. So one man I interviewed, his name is Daniel Brinkley. He's had 4 near-death experiences.
Wow.
He was struck by lightning, had open heart surgery twice, I believe, and brain surgery. And each time he had a life review where he had to go back to his time in Vietnam where he was in combat. And he told me he was vicious in combat. So he felt what it was like to be the person that he killed. And he also felt the indirect effects, even though they weren't quite as strong. He felt what it was like to be children who would no longer have fathers because he had killed the fathers in combat. So there's a real sense of interconnectedness that comes out of these experiences. When he comes back in his body, like many others, people's lives are changed forever. He became a hospice volunteer. So in his later life reviews, he got to see what it was like to be supporting someone at the bedside when the person was dying. So he got to see what it was like to be the dying person looking into his eyes as they were being comforted. So these are very powerful stories. There are many of them out there. The point here is that there seems to be a golden rule built into the fabric of reality itself, meaning treating others the way we want to be treated is part of reality. It's not just a nice idea. And Dr. Grayson from the University of Virginia, what he says when he talks to near-death experiencers is they say this is beyond morality. It's a natural law. So let's say that's true. Treat others the way you want to be treated, which ultimately is aligned with this feeling everyone talks about of like, well, all consciousness is unconditional love, and we're trying to tap into that. That's what people say in the near-death experience and many other states. So we want to engage in activities that are in that vein. Now let's look at the state. How does the state act? The state acts in a manner that is aggressive toward people and their private property, things that they own. So the principle that I talk about in the book is the non-aggression principle. And this is really voluntarism in a nutshell. You don't initiate aggression against other people or their bodies or their material private property, things that they rightfully own, meaning no physical violence, theft, coercion, extortion, fraud. You don't initiate those things, but you have a right in self-defense, of course. If you believe that, which to me is very much in alignment with the golden rule, like if you're thinking about a life review, you'd want to abide by that principle, most likely. The state, government, as we do it all over the world, violates the principle by its very nature, because it's not fully voluntary. We haven't fully consented explicitly to all of the things that are going on. And therefore, when it imposes on us, it is violating, in my opinion, the non-aggression principle and violating the spiritual principle of the golden rule. So that is highly problematic from a spiritual lens.
Am I just feeling that? Before we hop into the show, I want to let you know that you can grab your copy of my book, The New Wealth, Magnetize Abundance, Hold Your Wealth, and Leave a Legacy. It's available on Kindle, and you can get physical copies on Amazon as well. If you want to grab yourself a signed copy, head on over to carrienorley.com/New Wealth Book. This book is here on this planet at this time to help you move into a new era of money, wealth, and finances. It is way more than just information. It's an activation into infinite bliss, love, joy, abundance, and peace. If you implement what I talk about in this book, your life is sure to change and become more abundant. Someone recently left a review on Amazon saying the day that he read the book, he made $10,000. Celebrating that. Woo woo! I have actually had multiple people tell me that their finances have increased as a direct result of reading this book. So just do yourself a favor and go grab your copy of the book and actually read it so that you can discover how to magnetize abundance, hold on to the money that you receive, and grow your wealth and leave a legacy, financially or otherwise. Then please let me know what happens for you as a result. I always love hearing the wins from my readers and listeners. Go grab your copy today and remember to share on social media so that we can get the word out to even more people. And now, on to the show. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm like, I feel that deeply. I feel that deeply in that. Where does it get to be our choice? And where at what point, at what point do we stand for that? Or do we fall for that?
Yeah, that's the inflection point where we seem to be, because things are accelerating so quickly in terms of rights being taken away by what I consider to be an inherently aggressive institution and coercive institution, government, where we're at a crossroads. Are we going to succumb and allow aggression to be imposed upon us, or are we going to be free beings spiritually? And that's another part of this too. I view freedom as something inherent. It's not something that is given out by governments. We are inherently free beings as part of this one mind of consciousness. We're in bodies temporarily having this experience. And freedom doesn't, of course, give the right to initiate aggression against other people. That's not what I'm talking about with freedom. I'm talking about freedom abiding by this non-aggression principle and with the right to self-defense. But if we are innately free, then who is the government to micromanage our lives and tell us where we can and can't be free? That to me is also spiritually problematic. We have natural rights that the government seems to be violating.
It makes me think to me like the question to ask of ourselves, right, is like, are we showing up as our freest expression? Are we showing up in our freedom that is our God-given right? You know, and I think it's a really good question to ask ourselves.
That's such an important point. It's actually one of the most important points I would like to get across to audiences, because when we have this shift and realize that we're actually free, then these impositions by experts, so-called experts and governments, they will not have the same effect on us. When we realize that it's, even though we've grown up with it and we were taught in school, this is how it is, it's not how it is. If you look at things from a metaphysical perspective, there are real violations of basic principles here. So that mental shift, all of a sudden, I think, could have a big effect for us individually, but also when many of us realize it, all this, when things are imposed upon us, we'll say, wait, no, I don't agree with that, and you don't have a right to do that to me. So I'm within my right not to do that. And like that thought process starts to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. What's coming to me to like to add in here is one of the things I consider around government and big institutions. It's not just government. Like this goes beyond just government. Like we have plenty of big institutions who are creating influence in the world right now. And I keep thinking about how, you know, our kids, if you have children, like as a parent, you're a model to your children. And pretty much whether you want to or not, like you could say one thing and do another, they're going to follow what you do, not what you say. Right? Every time. And the kids, if you are a parent, you will understand this 100%. They are the biggest mirrors for you in your life. And there is not a damn thing you can do about it, except for change your own way of showing up so that you see it differently for them, right? You change your way of showing up, then they will respond. You don't even have to talk about it and they will shift. Sometimes it helps to talk about it. But when I think about this on a bigger level, right? Because that's a really at home, very big, very small level, which is of course in the oneness at a big level, right? I look at that and I think if I shift me and I can help shift for them, then they grow up in a different lifestyle. And this is how we change the planet, right? Is actually how I show up to teach them how they can grow up to be adults that are free and have their own conscious thought, right? And all the other things that I talk to them. But when I look at this from a bigger level, I look at the government and I go, okay, well, if that's the parent, right? And I'm the child, which effectively is the role that we at some level play, right? Have played in the past, then what I see, I will also replicate, right? Mm-hmm. And I make that okay, because that's what I'm being taught is the rules. It's the way that I'm supposed to live my life by. And so one of the things that I look at, like, how could we possibly, I'm going to talk to this, the economics of the world. How could we possibly think that at some grandiose level, any one of us has ever been taught to not be in debt? Because look at the government, right? Like we have been taught debt consciousness because the governments they just printed 1/3 of the debt of our debt, trillions of dollars of debt this year alone. Like we got to wonder what taxes are for when you can print out that many trillions of dollars overnight just because you want to. Like they have whatever they want, right? Yeah. And so we look at that, that's what's coming through for us. We look at, like you said, the violence, right? Like, oh, I can just go fight for what I want. It doesn't matter. I can break all rules. I can go across all boundaries, all places. And I just want to go claim that. So I'm going to, and my men might die, but who cares? Right. And all of these things that government says are okay. That's what then we say. And so then how do we show up? Well, I'm going to go fight for that. I'm going to take my gun out. I'm going to go shoot that person because I think that's my property. Government said it was okay. Of course I can go do that. Oh, I'm just going to go swipe this credit card. Sure. Everybody gets to be in debt because that's the way that it works. And how can we possibly think, when I look at this from a big level, how can we possibly expect that somehow one day we're just all going to, as human beings, like just be like, oh, I'm going to do it differently. No, we're not going to do it differently unless the government chooses to show up differently, or unless we choose to say what the government's doing is actually not a really great role model. I don't want them as a parent. Yeah. Right. Like, let me just look at that from a child perspective. Is that the parent that I want to model?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think part of the shift in consciousness is moving away from this idea that government is the mommy and daddy, which is what we are trained. It is this caring body, and we're the children that it's taking care of us. But if you break down the way we actually do government, this one I spend a lot of time thinking about. Why do we need government in the first place? You go back to like Thomas Hobbes and the political philosophers who say, well, if you didn't, then people they're stupid, they're irresponsible, they're warlike, and you would have complete chaos. So here's what we're going to do. This is the solution. We're going to have a government. And the government, we're going to take a subset of the population, of the stupid, irresponsible, and warlike people. We're going to put them in a position of power to be mommy and daddy for us. But it's okay because we're going to elect them. And we, the stupid, irresponsible, and warlike people, will magically become responsible enough to put the right people in power over us. So to me, the solution of this, how we do government, is doomed from the start. And yet we have this delusion of, well, no, this is government, and they are somehow supernatural. They're not just human beings like the rest of us. And when we break that spell, then I think you're right that we could have a shift everywhere because we won't look at them as role models.
Okay, so paint me a picture. So we've gone into what's not working.
Mhm.
We can look at it from a metaphysical consciousness perspective. We can say that together they definitely don't work. We got this far. So what's the future? What do you see in this voluntarism, or however you look at like what this experience looks like?
So the way I describe it in the later part of the book is a metaphysical political philosophy. And the political philosophy, you either have statism, which is the traditional way of doing government, whether you're on the right or the left, that's traditional, you have this government imposing, or voluntarism. That's the spectrum. And so I think voluntarism on the political part of the spectrum. But to me, that's insufficient on its own. There's a spiritual, non-spiritual aspect of it. The term that's often used is non-dual, non-duality, this idea that there's a one mind. And that's on one end of the spectrum, highly spiritual. And the other part of it is, some call it materialistic, physicalist, that consciousness comes from the brain. There's no spiritual. Life's random and meaningless ultimately, which is how I used to think for sure. So you end up with 4 quadrants, depending on where you are in the voluntarism versus statism, non-duality versus the materialistic, physicalist. And so what I say is we need to move to what I call non-dual voluntarism, which is this very spiritual, voluntary society. And that's really important because in a voluntary society, you don't have the quote unquote safety net that government claims to provide. So the government will say, you have to pay me or you're going to jail, which is also known as taxation. And the justification, it's a coercive process if you really think about it, especially since sometimes you're asked to fund things that you find immoral. That's pretty coercive. And if you don't listen, you go to jail. So some people would say taxation is theft. That would be the extreme way of putting it.
Totally, yeah.
But that, in addition to the ability to endlessly print money, now that we have central banks, provides funds to help people who are in need. And that many people will say, Mark, you're crazy. If you didn't have a state, what are we going to do? And I agree, it's a problem because the voluntarist society relies on charitability. You have to have that. You need people that are willing to help others because you're not going to have this government that can do it. So that's why, to me, the non-dual voluntarism is critical, because if you're spiritual, there's an automatic desire to want to help people much more than if you believe there's no meaning to life. It breeds more of a selfishness. Not to say that anyone who's just an atheist doesn't care about people at all. I don't mean that, but that you don't have that impulse in the same way. And I know this from personal experience because I've been on both sides of this. There's a different impulse when you think the meaning of life is much more about helping other people, like being strong in your individuality so that you can be of service. That's how I look at it. Mm-hmm. So if we have a spiritual, non-dual society who thinks about the one mind and thinks about life reviews, in addition to being in a voluntary society, you eliminate the coercive government. And at the same time, in theory, you could create a society that's more prosperous for everyone. So I recognize what I'm saying might sound totally insane considering where we are today. And I know some people probably roll their eyes and say, like, you're a dreamer, but I'm looking at, like, ultimately, what's the ideal society? If I look at the metaphysics and look at the statism, that's the picture that I see. And whether we can do it, I don't know.
I like dreamers. I'm a dreamer with you. Yeah, it's interesting. So then where do rules come from? And do we need rules?
So to me, rules come at the level of the individual or the private property owners. So you could easily end up with communities that look like government, except it's fully voluntary. And the rules are within a property or within a community where people subscribe to that. And if you don't like it, then you would go somewhere else and not engage. So ultimately it ends up being a free market. Fully free market. You don't have imposition from a government because there is no government.
That tickles me. I'm like, I like the vision of it. I'm like, in my mind, I'm like the practicality of it though, right? Because then do we have, I mean, just, this is my thoughts where I go. So then do you have the community that's like the, I'm going to say high vibe community, everything's peace, love, light, yada, yada. Right. And then they've come together in this unity, but are there people in the world who still haven't figured out the unity aspect of this? And they still want to go and be in a gang and experience life in that way? And then do they have their own entity where there's a shit ton of violence and and that's okay, and having guns and and I'm not saying that, I don't want to get into a gun conversation here, but like, you understand where I'm going with this, that it's like that that community is like, yes, violence is all good and there's no rules around that, and sure, we can go out and it's party until 5 o'clock in the morning and I can shoot whoever the fuck I want to shoot and there's no consequence to that.
Right. So the way I would look at that, and actually one of the chapters in the book, I go through kind of these hypotheticals because they're very natural questions. I'm glad you brought it up. And I'll preface the answer with whatever challenges we could talk about in voluntarism, there are equivalent challenges under the current status quo. And we just have become so accepting of them. The fact that there can be these massive powers killing each other in wars, and we just say, oh, that's war, but really it's mass murder. And at any time there could be nukes. Like, there's so many risks in the current way we do things.
Right.
But you're completely right. There are risks with this. You're going to have different types of people. And I still always think about it in terms of non-aggression principles. So if people are initiating aggression against other people or being physically violent, then that is cause for self-defense and also cause for other people to help in self-defense. So that would not necessarily solve it, but if there were a community where there's just murder everywhere, a highly spiritual, if you're in this non-dual society, people are going to want to get involved and say, look, this can't happen anymore. But in terms of other rules, where the example I use in my book is, think about drugs. From this non-dual voluntarist perspective, there's nothing about drugs that would violate the non-aggression principle because you're doing it to your own body. Unless you're on property where the rules are, the law is, you can't ingest this substance. Because then you're voluntarily engaging with that property and you would have to abide by whatever the laws are, whatever courts are in that property. That would be your voluntary
agreement,
your voluntary decision to be engaged in that part. But assume you're on property where there's no rules around that. Then my view on this is you can do whatever you want. It's up to you. And as long as you're not hurting someone else, if you hurt yourself, that is on you. And this gets into things like karma and whether you're hurting your spiritual connection. So it becomes up to the individual to be responsible for his or her decisions. And that determines the extent to which you exercise the rights. So the simple way of thinking about this is the voluntarist perspective tells you what your rights are, which is don't initiate aggression against someone's body or private property. That gives you tons of freedom. Whether you exercise that freedom depends on your assessment of spiritual principles, which is your own personal responsibility. So what I'm talking about is a much more evolved society where we're in a different state, but it's the individual has to be more responsible. Whereas right now, the government and everyone treats things as, well, everyone has to be taken care of. And that leads,
and
that
I
can
get
lead
free
to bad
handouts.
things.
And if anything else happens, I have a free handout. Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny that you actually even bring up drugs, because I was just in my Uber home from the airport from Florida the other day, and we got into this conversation, which led to a conversation around Denver being cleaned up. One of the parks had apparently had a lot of they'd opened it up to homeless people, which has become a big problem in Denver. But there was apparently a lot of drugs and needles. And they were saying they were picking up 50 to 100 needles a day as they've been cleaning out this area. And it's something that I've had a question around for a long time, because in Sydney, where I lived for 15 years, you'd go into public bathrooms in the city and there's places to put the needles so that they're safely disposed of, right? But I always had this question. If they're illegal, why do we have in a public restroom a place to dispose of them?
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is an illegal thing, and yet you're going to acknowledge the fact that people are using, and you're going to give them a place to do this even though it's illegal, right? And
Right.
so it's an interesting question, because like I've had that question, like if people know that this is happening and it's not stopped, then why is it illegal? Right? And not to say that I think it should or shouldn't be. That's not the question here at all. But like, it's an interesting thought that I had. I was like, if you're providing, and then we provide services for free for these people to overcome their addictions and all these things. Like, why is it, and it's what you're basically saying. It's like, well, if I volunteer this, if we actually remove some of these imposed rules, like, it's already happening. So much of the stuff is already happening. It's not like we're stopping it by saying it's illegal. We didn't stop drug trade because it's illegal.
No, totally. It's arbitrary. That's really what it is. These laws are arbitrary based on what a few politicians or experts think is best for everyone. Whether they actually do or not is a different question. But that's the gist of it, is they get to determine what the rules are for everyone else, and you don't have a say. You have to abide by it. And that's what I'm getting at, is that as long as we're not initiating aggression upon other people and their private property, and we're abiding by the spiritual principle of the golden rule, then it's on you. And you might end up making bad decisions.
And you might end up dead, and you might end up doing really stupid ass shit to your life. Right?
You might. And actually, that's another argument that I'm glad you raised, which is that when I think about like the meaning of life, to the extent that we can understand it, because I don't think we fully can, I view it as consciousness is evolving. The individual whirlpools are evolving, and the overall sea level's rising. That's what we're here to do. And we have a life review in the near-death experience, for example. If that's really what happens when we die, I don't know, maybe it is for some of us. If that's real, then it's almost like showing us how we did in this game that we're living in. And therefore, we need to, if the purpose of life is around this ability to evolve, and this gets into things like past lives, and past lives indicate that we have multiple chances to have new learning experiences, then the opportunity to learn is critical for society. And that's why, for me, having a liberated society is the ultimate, we have to have that, because that gives us a chance to learn and grow. It gives us a chance to make mistakes and also to thrive. You need both. When government comes in and says, we are going to eliminate all risk because we know what's best for you, you're going to have no freedom, but we're going to eliminate all risk, like what's happening right now with the pandemic. That's what's happened. They are taking this extreme position on what they perceive to be risk, ignoring all the other illnesses that they don't seem to care about and all the other things that don't seem to be a problem. We're going to eliminate all this risk, and you're not going to have the same freedoms. And if you don't have the same freedoms, then you don't have the same opportunities in life, and therefore you can't make as many mistakes and have as many successes in the same way. You can't have that same diversity.
So powerful, because ultimately we are all just spiritual beings here to learn. Like, if we were in spirit form, we'd have perfection. I mean, that's what it is. Like, you come back to the wholeness and who you of everything, of the divinity. And so when we come into this form, the whole freaking purpose of being here in human form is to have lessons, the good ones and the ones that don't work so well, so that we can experience. There's one of my favorite books. It's called The Little Soul in the Sun. I think it's by Neil Donald Walsh, and it's a child's book. And it talks about the spirits that come down, and they say, they're two spirits, and they say they decide they're going to come down to earth, and one wants to learn forgiveness. And so the other spirit says to him, okay, well, I'll come down with you to teach you, to help you learn forgiveness. But then you have to remember, I am all that I am, right? I'm doing this for you, right? Because I'm going to have to do something that you really don't like for you to experience what it is for forgiveness. I'm going to have to hurt you at some level, right? And so it's like we come for the experience of forgiveness, of love, of hate, of jealousy, of rage, of peace, of joy. We come to experience that because in the spiritual form, it's just bliss all the time. Like, that's the way I look at it. Like, we are just oneness. We are in the wholeness of we are. And so in the human form is where we get to experience emotion, which means that we have to learn these things. And as a parent, I come back to a parent again, like, you want to protect your kids. And I know I can be that person that can be like, oh, I just want to keep them in this little beautiful bubble and like protect them. But at the end of the day, like, they're at the point now, I keep getting reminders that at 12 and 9 years old boys, right? That it's like, Carrie, the lessons that they learn right now where they're going to fall on their face are going to hurt less and be less expensive than if they learn it when they're 18 in a car and irresponsible, when they're 20 and on a piss up in a bar some night and in a brawl, versus I'm just going to have a fight with my friend on the playground, right? And so it's really fascinating to have to allow ourselves as a parent, to allow myself to let go of the control, to be like, okay, go try this out. You may fall on your face. I will be here and I will love you through it. Right. And that's ultimately what you're saying. And I love this, like, ultimately what you're saying and government is saying, we're not allowing, as the government, the way that it's set up, the way that it is, for us as the quote unquote kids, right, to fall on our faces. and to experience the bliss, right? Because there are highs and lows in life. And as much as you want to talk about a non-dual society, like as humans, we live in a duality. Like that is our existence. That is our experience. And so I have found, and anyone who's listening to this podcast knows, I've been on a journey to overcome bipolar stuff. I have found that it's not about saying that we don't have these polars. It's saying, how can I live in peace with them? Right. And so I have to experience, I've had to spend my lifetime experiencing the two polars to be like, okay, so where's middle? How can I continually bring myself down there? But if I didn't experience the fucked upness of riding these highs and lows, which it is, it's a mind fuck for sure. And it's brought me some pain and it's brought me some joy. I wouldn't know like, right, I can be somewhere without, like in the middle of this. I don't have to ride all of this. And so it's the same with government, like without the freedom to allow ourselves to express fully, to be fully individuals, to have our full freedoms and our full expression on this planet, then ultimately we're not being allowed to learn our greatest lessons.
I agree completely. And what government does is basically steers the experience and tells you what risk you can and can't take for us. So it's really a mentality of not wanting to control people. That maybe is the core of all this. Of, Carrie, you're going through challenges right now, and I give you advice and say, I think you should do this, this, and this, and you don't do it. It's your decision to do that or not. And it's not for me to control. And it might be in your best interest to make those mistakes for your learning. I don't know what your karmic situation is. I don't know what the world's karmic situation is. So we do our best, but we don't force people to do things. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, one of Yogananda's masters, Sri Lahiri Mahasaya, he said something to the effect of, always remember that you belong to no one and no one belongs to you. That's really the principle of all this. Let people be. If they're initiating aggression, that's a different story. You have a right to defend yourself and help other people. But let people do their thing and don't say you need to have this experience. I guess if you're a parent, it's a little bit different. But just in everyday living, we live in a world now where it seems like people know what's best for me and you. And if I'm not listening to them, then you're evil or something. There's this desire to control. And maybe that's where the shift is on the planet. Those who really, some people do want to control, or they want to feel like everyone's doing the same thing. And other people say, no, I think you should be free and have the freedom to choose. You might disagree with me, but that's fine as long as you're not hurting anyone.
Right. Oh, Mark, so good. It's interesting. Like, cause I mean, at the end of the day, we both see this beautiful vision of a future that, ultimately I believe, and I wrote this book, and I think both of us can agree that we both have a vision that is not explainable yet, that does not exist on this planet yet, that I have no idea how it will be here. Like in my mind, as I was writing this, I was like, how is it physically possible for us to have infinite abundance and joy and bliss and love? And the only thing that I can keep coming back to is if we took full responsibility for our lives. I mean, this has been at the root cause of the root of the purpose of me being on this planet for as long as I can remember, since 15 years ago when I started learning NLP. If I took full responsibility for myself, full responsibility, which most people do not understand really, really, really what that means. If I took full responsibility for myself and I stopped pointing a finger at any other person on this planet except for myself, and I go, okay, I am the creator of my reality, and every single thing, and this comes back to that quantum physics, every single thing I see in my reality, I have created, right? Because it's all just an illusion. None of it's real. And if I've created this, then I can change this. And if I take full responsibility and I stop blaming every other human on this planet for my stuff, then there would be no war. There would be no need for aggression, because I'm looking at it going, well, it's not your fault, it's mine. Where do I take responsibility for this? Yeah. And if I own all of that, then I can also then have peace with that. I created that. Okay. So at peace, if I created this, how can I shift this? Okay. And then we can start to, again, have this regenerative experience of wealth and abundance and love and joy and unity, because individually we are one, but together we come together as this collective consciousness that can ultimately create anything we desire, because it's all an illusion.
And on that sense of responsibility also brings the focus to trying to improve ourselves and being the best version of ourselves. I think they go hand in hand, and that would automatically take away some of this desire for power that we see in other places. And that's what's tricky about this, is that in the current structure of the world, you only need a few people in very high positions of power who can pull strings in certain ways to do a lot of damage And that's one of the things I grapple with is, well, what's the critical mass of people who really start to get freedom, and what's needed to counterbalance the existing power structures and the ability for a few people who just don't have empathy, for example, and just want power. They're not thinking about personal responsibility in this way that you are. How do we counterbalance it? And I don't know the answer. I have this idealistic view that at some point there will be a critical mass, and I'm doing my best to at least ignite the fire, or at least open the door, because once you start thinking this way, it begins to unravel very quickly. So
Yes.
we'll see what happens.
This is what makes me I'll say this and then we'll wrap this up. But I seriously cannot remember his name, and it's driving me crazy. It's a guy who was in the CIA, and he made some documentaries of the fifth dimension, alien stuff. Like he took all the alien Stephen
Greer?
Yes, Stephen Greer, right? So you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, I've seen the documentary, probably the same one that you're talking about. Yeah.
And so it's fascinating, right? Like how literally, I mean, he did through the CIA research, he worked with extraterrestrial beings. And so now you can go and look him up. He actually takes people into fields or places on the planet that are gridded, and he finds whatever that he has the experience of, how can I call in extraterrestrial beings? And at the end of this movie, this really, really hit home for me. He said it will take 1% of humanity to shift consciousness for all of humanity to be able to change. And I was like, being the visionary that I am, like, I was like, 1%, that's it? It was like a few 100 million people. It was like 100 million, whatever it was. It was not like, when I was like, wait a minute, that's totally possible. Totally. I mean, like, I don't know all of them, but between you and me and all the other people out there talking about it, there's got to be that many.
Yeah.
Right. And all of a sudden I was like, 1%, we can do this. 1%. It's not the whole planet, but because by the time 1% of us embodies this, because that's what it's going to take. It's not just going to take talking about it and sitting here and having these conversations. It's like, how do I truly live this life?
Yeah.
How do I live exactly what you and I are talking about here? Whatever version that we can keep going to at the highest level of it, then that ripples. Right. And we talk about it. And then the next person, my neighbor down the street, or my friend over there, or the client that I work with, or the person who's listening to this podcast goes, oh, wait a minute. Well, she can do it. So can I do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it's not just 1%. I get the chills. Right. And so that's just my vision. I'm like, 1%. All I got to do is think about 1%. That's not that many people. Okay. It's still hundreds of millions of people, but it's not that many people in the relation to the billions of people on this planet. And that's where I hold, like, okay, that's why I sit here on this podcast. I'm sure this is why you sit here on your, in your podcast, on my podcast, writing the books that we write, is because inevitably you and I both want to affect, influence, and impact in a positive way, this 1%, so that we can have this massive change on the planet.
Totally. Yeah, that's if there's a goal, I think it's for me, I like to share and empower people, because this knowledge has empowered me in so many ways. So it's like my way of sharing it. And you never know who it's going to impact, or when, or how. And that's the mystery of all this. There's a phenomenon known as the butterfly effect, which relates to what you're talking about, of like 1% and what's the tipping point. The butterfly effect is that small changes can have massive outcomes in the end. And what people often reference is a meteorologist who was doing weather predictions. He changed one of the variables by a few decimal points, so he didn't even really notice it. But he ended up with a completely different weather prediction, because this one variable, you end up with a non-linear effect. So it's sort of like if you push a door with a very little force, you see that the door doesn't move much. But if you push it hard, it moves a lot. That's a linear relationship. There's a relationship between how hard you push and how fast the door closes. With this other stuff, it might be non-linear, where you have like a tiny little effect and it has this massive change. So the butterfly effect is, mathematically speaking, a butterfly flapping its wings in China could cause a hurricane in New York. You change the variables that tiny amount, and you don't see it like the way the dominoes hit, to where there's this major change. So I try to keep that in the back of my mind, because like seeing what's happening in the world, it's easy to become pessimistic and say, oh my goodness, this is not going to work. But I don't know. Yeah, we're crazy. It's getting so, it's the opposite of everything we're talking about here. And like, people don't see it. And I can't believe how much mind control exists. But then there's this other part of me that says, well, that's based on what I'm seeing. We live in a multidimensional quantum universe. I don't even understand it. And we don't know what shifts in consciousness can do. It's a non-physical effect. So when Carrie shifts her consciousness, when I shift my consciousness, when your listeners, we don't see the dominoes happening on a non-physical level. And that's where I hold out hope, because we don't know. If we had the helicopter's perspective and we could see like we're in a maze, that's the analogy I like to use. In the maze, we don't know what's exactly is ahead because we can only see so much. But if you had the helicopter's perspective, you would be able to see much more. And there's this higher dimensional perspective that probably where the picture can be seen and we just don't have access to it. And what I hold out hope for is that at that higher level, there's a chance for us to get to a better place.
Oh, Mark, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for doing your work. Thank you for this book. Thank you for all of your books. Thank you for your podcast. Please, let's wrap this with, if you have any final thoughts and how people can find you.
Well, my first final thought is, if you've listened this far, thank you very much, because Carrie, you asked great questions and we covered a ton of ground. I mean, I think this conversation could be very powerful for someone who has not thought about the issues in this way, because I think about myself like 2 years ago when I hadn't had the time to analyze all of it. This is a very paradigm shifting idea. And I think one starts to live differently. So I guess what I would say is to spend, if these topics are of interest, to spend some time reflecting on what we talked about and work through, because it's such a paradigm shift on so many levels. It can be like difficult to accept it. But once the ideas become more embedded, it's like a different way of being and living. So I would just encourage your listeners and your audience to spend a little bit of time, even though we're very busy, all of us, to spend time thinking about these topics, because that can have effects in other areas of our life too.
So true. Thank you. And thank you for that, your kind words. I loved this conversation, and I hope that anybody who is here listening, thank you again. As you said, thank you so much for being here, because we dove deep today. There's a lot to unravel for a person, if you are listening, that hasn't considered a lot of this. And I know I'm going to say, you probably agree with me, I don't expect that any single human being can take all of this in and overnight just change, right? No. But it's like, if there's one thing, like just consider, what's the one thing that you want to take away from this right now that you can take an action step on, that you can have a little bit more embodiment, that you could consider one piece of your freedom differently, that you could consider that the world is just, an illusion. All of these huge concepts, like what's one thing that you could take away and start to bring into your life through your embodiment, through your action, through your experience, and through your belief. And then come back and listen again, because it's multi-layered, right? Like if you pick one, then maybe in a few months you come back and you listen to this again and you'll hear something completely different in another layer. And take that on and see, and the other thing I would say is spread this. Like, this is a really important conversation. So if you have found value in this, please, 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 if you're listening, share this to your socials, share this however you possibly can. Tag people that you think would, if you're on social media and you're seeing this, tag people that you think that could benefit from hearing this. Because whilst we are visionaries, and whilst the current consciousness of the planet isn't in the place that we are at a collectively huge level, there are those of us who are. And it only takes this 1% of us to decide. It only takes this 1% of us to decide that we get to have this and we can create this utopia. 100%. So thank you. How do people find you? How do people reach out to you? How do people share this information and go in and learn more about you?
Well, my books are all on Amazon, and they're available Kindle, paperback or hardcover, depending on the book, and Audible. So depending on what you like.
I saw you just put this one out on Audible. I was like, woo!
Yes.
It's an effort.
I read the book all 3 times, which is an experience. So that's always fun, but I know people like to take in books in different ways. So we wanted to make it available in all 3 ways. And also my website is my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. My podcast, Where is My Mind? It's an 8-episode series where we go through things like psychic abilities, the life review, near-death experiences. I interview dozens of scientists, and we have clips of my interviews spliced into a narrative. So Where is My Mind? Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the normal places. And I'm also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Mark Gober, author.
Amazing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for doing the work that you do in the world. It has been amazing to have you here today.
Thank you as well, Carrie.
Just a quick message for you about a new mastermind called UNPLUG that I am inviting you into. There is an amazing buzz around the crypto space, and with that comes a whole new language and an education to be able to take advantage of early adoption as we move into this amazing space. So many people think that you have missed this early stage, but we are still there and you still most definitely have time to get in and dive deep. This is why I created UNPLUG. I know many of you want to learn to take the cash you are making and get it working for you so that you can create another form of income and eventually financial freedom. I also know that there are many of you out there that realize the financial system is corrupt and not designed for us, and you want a way out. The crypto space is amazing and also a learning curve. If you don't know what you're doing, you can run into all kinds of mishaps that will lose you money. So if you want to accelerate your wealth creation and learn how to decentralize yourself and your biz so that you can become sovereign, UNPLUG is for you. I will show you how to get returns that range anywhere from 5% up to, I had 61% compounding interest in one of my accounts just a few weeks ago. This is not always available, but it definitely exists. We will be learning about NFTs, DeFi, privacy, and learning how to make smart investment decisions and getting your biz, crypto and Web 3.0 ready and more. There are so many amazing people already signed up and getting moving, and the caliber of people coming into this space is amazing. Not just the participants, but also the guests I have lined up. It's not just about me. This is a mastermind where everyone will learn and grow in this new space together. If you are ready to leap into the new wealth and break free of the banking system, this is for you. Please message me on Facebook or Insta for more details. Our first call begins on the 26th of January. If you are hearing this message after that, please do still reach out and let's see how I can support you to get into the crypto space. And now back to the show.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you love what you heard, please help us get this message out to more people, because together we rise. Please review it, subscribe to the show, and share on social media. When you share, please tag me. On Insta, I'm at Carrie Norley, and on Facebook, I'm facebook.com/Carrie Norley 1, or Carrie Kaplan Norley is my official name there. Please come and connect with me on social media and say hello. I love hearing from my listeners. And thank you so much for your support. I'm so excited to help you bring in the new wealth.